Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen. A long time ago there lived a woman who wanted a little tiny child, but had no idea where to get one. Finally she went to a kind old witch for help. "Oh, we shall be able to manage that," said the witch. "Here is a barley seed for you. Plant it in a flower pot and see what appears." The woman gave the witch 12 pennies. Then she went home and planted the seed. Instantly, a handsome flower with red and yellow petals sprang up. It was a real tulip, you can see that. But right in the middle of it was a tiny little girl on a green stool. She was lovely and delicate, and little more than an inch tall. The woman named her Thumbelina. For a bed, Thumbelina was given a shiny walnut shell that had blue petals for a mattress and a rose leaf for a blanket. During the day she often played on the table in a bowl of water. A large tulip petal floated on the water, and on this little Thumbelina sailed from one side of the bowl to the other. She would sing, too, with such delicacy and charm as was never heard before. One night, as Thumbelina lay in her pretty bed, an old ugly toad hopped in through the window. Here is a lovely wife for my son," the toad whispered to herself, and she snatched the shell where the tiny girl slept. The toad moved so quietly that Thumbelina never even woke. In minutes, the old toad carried the shell to a muddy swamp. She picked a water lily leaf far from shore, and swam to it with the walnut shell in which little Thumbelina lay. Then she worked all night preparing a home in the mud for her ugly son and the tiny girl. When Thumbelina woke early in the morning, she began to cry bitterly. Water surrounded her, and she could not reach land. After a while, the old toad brought her ugly son to the leaf where Thumbelina sat. "Here is my son," she said proudly. "Soon he will be your husband, and you will live together most comfortably down in the mud." "Rock, rock, rock, rock," said the son. Then he and the old toad left. Thumbelina's pitiful cries were too much for the fish to bear. They gnawed at the stems of the leaf with their teeth. Finally the leaf broke off and floated away, carrying Thumbelina through narrow passages where the toad could not follow. The tiny girl began to feel joy once more. But Thumbelina's freedom was not to last, for a big beetle caught sight of her. In an instant he fixed his claw around her slender waist and flew off with her into a tree. He thought she was beautiful and wished to keep her always. Soon other beetles came to visit. Their opinions were quite different. The young lady beetles twitched their feelers and said, "Ugh, she looks like a human being." And all the mother beetles said how ugly she is. Finally, the beetle who had captured Thumbelina took her out of the tree and placed her on a daisy. Thumbelina lived all summer alone in the woods. She made a bed of woven straw and put it under a huge leaf that sheltered her from the rain. She sucked honey from the flowers for food, and in the mornings drank the dew that lay on the leaves. In this way the summer and autumn passed, but then came the winter. The birds flew away and their songs were heard no more. It began to snow, and every snowflake that fell on Thumbelina was like a whole shovelful upon an ordinary person. Thumbelina knew she had to search out a warmer place to live. Not far from the woods was a large cornfield, but the corn had long ago been harvested. Nothing remained but dry stubble. It was difficult to walk through, and oh, how Thumbelina shook with the cold. She might have given up had she not come to the door of a field mouse's home. The door led to a cozy hole under the stubble. Poor Thumbelina stood just inside the door like a beggar. She had not eaten for 2 days. "You poor little thing," said the field mouse, who was a kind soul most of the time. "Come in and have dinner with me. You may stay here for the winter if you keep my room clean and tell me stories, for I'm very fond of them." Weeks passed, and Thumbelina did as the mouse said. For the most part she was content. Then one day the mouse told Thumbelina that a guest would be coming over. "My neighbor, the mole, will be stopping by," said the mouse. "His house is grand, and he wears a beautiful black velvet coat. Of course, because he is a mole, he cannot see well except in the dark, and so he spends his life underground. You must tell him all the most beautiful stories you know." And so they were introduced. The mole came calling as often as possible. Thumbelina told him many beautiful stories. Soon enough the mole fell in love with her because of her sweet voice, but Thumbelina could not bring herself to like him. He often made cruel remarks about the sun and the flowers, even though he had rarely seen them. One day the mole made a long tunnel from his house to the mouse's house. He insisted on guiding Thumbelina through it the first time. The tunnel was quite dark, and though the mole could barely see in daylight, he saw very well in the dark. The two of them had gotten no further along the tunnel than the halfway point when Thumbelina suddenly stumbled against a large object. As dark as it was, she could not see what the obstacle was that lay before them, and did not want to go on. The mole impatiently explained that it was merely a dead bird. "I'll show you," said the mole, and he thrust his broad nose up to the roof and made a hole to let some light in. In the middle of the floor lay a swallow, with his pretty wings closely pressed to his sides. No doubt the poor bird had died of cold. Thumbelina felt a tear slide down her cheek. The mole had no such feelings. He kicked the bird and said, "Now it will pipe no more." The mole quickly closed up the hole that let in the daylight and finished his tour. He did not care to discuss the bird any more. That night Thumbelina could not sleep. She quietly made a blanket out of hay. Guided only by a small lantern, she bravely carried the blanket through the dark tunnel to the swallow. She covered him and laid soft cotton wool around his sides. "Goodbye, you sweet bird," she said, "and thank you for your songs through the summer." But as Thumbelina began to leave, she was startled to hear a faint thumping sound. It was the bird's heart. He was not dead after all, and now that he was warmer, he began to revive. "Many, many thanks, you sweet child," said the swallow in a feeble voice. "You have made me much warmer. I shall soon have strength to fly again." Then, as his voice grew stronger, the swallow told Thumbelina how he had torn his wing on a thorny bush. He could not keep up with the other birds, which were leaving for warm lands far away. At last he fell to the ground, which gave way as the mole pushed dirt around to make the tunnel. "Oh," said Thumbelina, "it is still so cold outside. Stay here, and I will take care of you." Thumbelina helped the swallow to a place in the tunnel where the mole never wandered. "You will be safe here," she said, "for the mole is very forgetful. If he does not see you, he will not think to ask about your whereabouts." And so all winter long Thumbelina secretly tended the swallow and grew very fond of him. As soon as spring came, the swallow was ready to leave. He reopened the hole that the mole had made. Sun streamed in deliciously, and the swallow asked if Thumbelina would leave with him. But Thumbelina thought that leaving would be unkind to the old mouse, and so she said no. "Goodbye, then. you sweet pretty girl," said the swallow. He flew out into the sunshine. Thumbelina sadly watched him go. Soon after, the tiresome mole announced that he and Thumbelina would get married in the autumn. Thumbelina cried. She told the mouse her true feelings, certain that the mouse would not agree to the mole's plan. But all the mouse said was, "Fiddle-dee-dee, don't be stubborn. The mole has a beautiful black velvet coat. His kitchen and cellar are full. You should thank heaven for such a husband." So wedding plans were made. Thumbelina had no way to escape, for the corn had grown quite tall and thick around the mouse's house. It was a dangerous forest for a tiny girl who was little more than an inch high. "Goodbye, you bright sun," Thumbelina said on the day she was to marry the mole. She stood just outside the entrance to the mouse's house and stretched her arms skyward. "Give my love to the dear swallow if you happen to see him." Just then Thumbelina heard "tweet, tweet" from above her head. She looked up. It was the swallow, as delighted to see her as she was to see him. Thumbelina told him of her problems and that she was to live underground where the sun never shines. "Leave with me this time," said the swallow. "We'll fly far from the mole to a land where the sun shines with great splendor. You saved my life when I lay frozen in the tunnel. Let me help you now." "Yes, this time I will go with you," said Thumbelina, and she seated herself on the bird's back with her feet on his outspread wings. The swallow carried her high above the forests and lakes, and high above the biggest mountains where the snow never melts. At last they reached warm lands, where the sun shone beautifully and the sky seemed twice as high, but still the swallow flew on, until he reached a place with magnificent green trees on the shores of a blue sea. Near the sea stood a dazzling white, very old marble palace. Vines twisted around the pillars, and beautiful flowers grew big and colorful everywhere. The swallow rested upon one of the pillars. "If you will choose one of the flowers growing here," he said, "I will place you on it, and at last you will live as happily as you have ever imagined." Thumbelina clapped her little hands with joy and chose a lovely white flower to become her home. The swallow flew her to it and gently settled her upon one of the broad leaves. To her astonishment, Thumbelina found a man in the middle of the flower, a man no bigger than she. He wore a lovely golden crown and had beautiful bright wings upon his back. When the tiny man saw Thumbelina, he was delighted. She was the prettiest girl he had ever seen. He placed his crown on her head and asked her name, and if she would be his wife and queen of the flowers. Thumbelina was struck by his kindness. He would certainly be a very different kind of husband from the toad's son, or the mole with his black velvet coat, so she agreed to marry the handsome king. Suddenly, out of every flower stepped a little lady or gentleman, all so friendly that it was a pleasure to be in their company. They greeted Thumbelina warmly and gave her a pair of pretty wings. Then they fastened the wings to her back so that she could fly from flower to flower like they did. "You shall not be called Thumbelina," said the king. "That is such an ugly name, and you are so pretty. We shall call you May." And so Thumbelina had found a home where she did not have to fear anyone or anything, and where the sun always shone, and where the birds always sang beautiful songs.